Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 2 creepy solved disappearances, but despite them being solved, they are no less disturbing. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. In the summer of 2004, on the beautiful Spanish island of Mallorca, a bartender stood at a bar, going about his day, laughing and joking with the tourists coming for a vacation. Although the bartender wasn't originally from there, he had a nice little life for himself. He had friends and a girlfriend, and as far as a relaxing place to live, it didn't get much better than the island. However, in the next second, the man's life would completely change. Someone walked into the bar, and although the bartender didn't know who they were, they recognized him. This would be the beginning of the end for him. As a child, Mary Gow was always close to her parents and 5 brothers. According to her brother David, she was smart, easygoing, and fun to be around. On the other hand, she was also quieter and more reserved than many girls her age. Mary eventually got a job as a legal secretary in Balbriggan, Ireland, about 20 miles north of Dublin. At the same time, self-employed computer analyst Colin Whelan also lived in Balbriggan. And according to some sources, he knew Mary and her family for years. Up until then, though, they were just casual acquaintances. But that changed one evening in 1993 when they ran into one another at a local pub called the Huntsman Inn. Colin was handsome, driven, and outgoing, and at that point, Mary had never had a boyfriend. Needless to say, she was flattered that he showed her so much attention, and soon they began dating, and things got serious almost immediately. And Mary's parents and brothers welcomed Colin into the family with open arms. The couple would break up for a brief spell in 1995, but they got back together and bought a house in 1997. But then, tragedy struck when it looked like everything was falling into place. It's unclear where Colin went or who he was with on the night of Friday, January 31st, 1997, but there was a fair amount of alcohol in his system when he got behind the wheel of his car just before 10 p.m. Shortly thereafter, he was involved in a violent head-on collision with an elderly couple a few miles from town. And tragically, a 61-year-old woman was killed in the accident. Her husband was driving that night, but he and Colin walked away with relatively minor injuries. Afterward, Colin faced drunk driving and maybe even manslaughter or vehicular homicide charges, and if convicted, he could have spent years behind bars. To Mary, it looked like her once-in-a-lifetime romance was all but over. But in the end, Colin was only convicted of careless driving. The judge gave him little more than a slap on the wrist, and afterward, he never spoke about the accident to Mary, her family, or anyone else. Mary knew that this hung over him like a dark cloud, but they put it behind them and eventually announced that they were going to tie the knot in September of 2000. Mary worked tirelessly to ensure that no wedding detail got overlooked, because after all, everyone knew it was going to be the most important day of her life. Colin was also busy, but his preparations were far more private in nature. By early 2001, Colin and Mary had only been married for about 6 months, and at least on the outside, they still looked like the quintessential happy newlyweds. But this carefully crafted facade crumbled in dramatic fashion on the night of Wednesday, February 28th, when Colin dialed 999 in a frantic state. He would go on to tell the emergency operator that there had been a terrible accident in his home and his 27-year-old wife Mary was unconscious and bleeding from the nose. When police and EMTs arrived a few minutes later, he was kneeling over Mary at the bottom of the stairs. She was wrapped in a thick comforter, and by then, she'd flatlined. This was immediately more than a little odd because fall victims rarely experience heart failure. Either way, Mary was rushed to Beaumont Hospital. Colin followed in his car, and they arrived just after midnight on the morning of Thursday, March 1st, 2001. Tragically, though, emergency room physicians weren't able to resuscitate Mary, and she was pronounced dead on arrival a few minutes later. When the chaos finally subsided, they noticed that she had marks on her neck and chest that were more consistent with strangulation than a fall down a stairway. In addition, a nurse noticed that Colin had suspicious scratches on his chest. Mary's mother arrived at the hospital shortly after 1 a.m., and at that point, she only knew that her daughter had been injured in a tragic accident. As she ran down the hallway, she saw Colin slumped over on a bench with his head in his hands. When she asked how Mary was, he looked up and said, "She's dead." Mary's family was understandably inconsolable when they arrived at the hospital later that morning, but according to Mary's mother, Colin didn't even show the slightest bit of genuine emotion. And almost right away, detectives were pretty sure that Colin's version of events wasn't entirely accurate. For one, the accident looked staged. Mary's body seemed to be in a contrived and unnatural position. In addition, the ligature marks on her neck and the scratches on Colin's chest seemed to indicate a very different altercation. Then, later that day, a state pathologist confirmed that Mary's death had been caused by asphyxiation. The pathologist would also find an abrasion on Mary's back that indicated she'd been dragged across the floor after her death. To investigators, although they didn't have a direct admission, the evidence already seemed to be overwhelming, and incredibly, even more would come out following an investigation. When crime scene technicians searched the home, they found small drops of blood that matched samples taken from Mary during the autopsy. Investigators also dug into Colin's past to get an idea of his personality and the nature of his previous relationships. One former girlfriend said that Colin assaulted her multiple times even though they dated for only a short time, and later forensics found evidence of damning internet searches Colin made in the months leading up to his marriage and a convenient life insurance policy. Prior to getting married, he took out a $200,000 life insurance policy on his soon-to-be wife, and interestingly, he'd receive the double payment or £400,000 if she died within 10 years of their wedding date. Colin also did dozens of internet searches using phrases like loss of consciousness, strangulation, and asphyxiation. Even more disturbingly, he downloaded a transcript from a case in the United States in which serial offender Henry Louis Wallace did this to nearly a dozen women and wrapped some of their bodies in a comforter to delay the natural cooling process. Initially, when he was asked why he wrapped Mary in a comforter on the night she died, Colin claimed that the 999 operator instructed him to do it because it would keep her warm. But he apparently didn't know that 999 calls were recorded, so when investigators listened to the audio and reviewed the transcript, it was clear that the operator never gave him any such instructions. By then, the operating theory was that Colin murdered Mary in their bedroom, then he dragged her body down the stairs, staged it on the landing, and wrapped it in a comforter, just like Henry Louis Wallace. Colin was then arrested, charged with murder, and transported to Dublin's notorious Clover Hill prison in April of 2001. Surprisingly though, he was eventually released on bond, but to prevent him from fleeing, he had to surrender his passport and check in at the police station near his home every day while awaiting his trial, which was scheduled to begin in October of 2003. This 2-year delay gave Colin more freedom and breathing room than most defendants charged with such serious crimes, and for Mary's family, the waiting was absolutely unbearable. There was no guarantee that Colin would be convicted, and in the meantime, he was essentially a free man while they struggled to put their broken lives back together. In the early going, Colin worked with his attorneys, but by the spring of 2003, it was clear that the case against him was about as airtight as it possibly could be. Then, in March of that year, he disappeared without a trace. A few days later, his vehicle, clothes, and a few personal items were found at Howth Head on a towering cliff overlooking the Irish Sea. It initially looked like he cracked under the pressure and decided to end things on his own accord. At the same time, though, investigators had a suspicion that the same type of person who would potentially murder their wife would also be capable of staging their own passing. This was confirmed later when they discovered that he managed to get a new passport using a neighbor's name. 1,500 kilometers away, Colin was working as a bartender at a popular resort on the Spanish island of Majorca. By all accounts, he led a comfortable and fun-filled life there for more than a year. He made new friends, met tourists from all over the world, and even had a serious girlfriend. He told everyone that his parents were dead, that he didn't have any brothers or sisters, and that he'd probably never return to the country of his birth. By then, keeping his head down and blending in with the crowd had become second nature. Colin's luck eventually ran out in the summer of 2004 when an Irish tourist familiar with Mary's death called the Irish police after recognizing him at the bar. With the help of the Spanish police, the 33-year-old was then arrested and flown back to Ireland in handcuffs a few weeks later. Colin pleaded guilty when his trial finally got underway at the Central Criminal Court in the spring of 2005. During the trial, he wore a dark suit, remained emotionless, and never took the stand in his own defense. In fact, the only time he spoke was to confirm his identity. The prosecution would go on to call a string of witnesses, including the detectives who worked the case as well as the medical examiner who performed the autopsy shortly after Mary's death. Their testimony was especially surprising to Mary's family because they weren't aware that Colin planned her murder or that he bought the life insurance policy months before they were married. Near the end of the trial, his defense attorney read a statement to Mary's mother and the rest of her family that apparently was written by Colin himself. It's unclear why Colin didn't read it himself, but whatever the case, he apologized for killing Mary and said that he'd live with the horrible regret and sorrow for the rest of his life. Needless to say, the statement came across as insincere. Afterward, Mary's mother addressed Colin in the court before the sentence was handed down. According to her, the one glaring mistake in her daughter's tragically short life was that she fell in love with Colin. As for his lukewarm apology, she claimed that he was only sorry that he got caught and that his charmed life in Majorca came to an abrupt end. But later, she told the press that being a grieving mother and attending to her sons was hard enough and that she just didn't have the time or energy to hold a grudge against him. Colin was then convicted and sentenced to life in prison. True to form, he remained stoic as his sentence was read. Nancy Lee Eagleson was born in the town of Paulding in northwest Ohio on Wednesday, July 3, 1946. Her father, Don, managed the local bowling alley, and her mother, Betty, worked at the drive-in, and the couple eventually had more children, but as the first, Nancy was their pride and joy. As far as we know, she and her siblings had relatively happy and uneventful childhoods, and by all accounts, the Eaglesons were an active and close-knit family. Nancy, being the oldest, often took care of her younger siblings when her parents were busy, and everyone found her to be a happy and funny girl who did well in school and enjoyed going to church on Sunday. 6 decades ago, Paulding had a population of about 3,000 residents, and like small towns everywhere, it had its fair share of crime, from theft and public drunkenness to domestic incidents and assaults. But as serious as they were, kidnappings, crimes against children, and murders were almost unheard of. At least they were until the fall of 1960. 14-year-old Nancy and her family attended church on the morning of November 13th, 1960, like they did nearly every Sunday. And that afternoon, she and her 5-year-old sister Cheryl went to a double feature at the local movie theater. They began walking home at about 6:30 that evening, but they decided to stop for some soda on the way. The sun had already set by the time they left the restaurant approximately 20 minutes later, but even so, it wasn't a big deal even for girls their age. Paulding was a safe community and children regularly walked around town even after dark. The walk home from the restaurant should have taken about 10 to 15 minutes, but a dark sedan pulled alongside them on a quiet, lonely stretch of road a few minutes later. The driver then rolled down his window and asked if they needed a ride. The 2 girls declined and kept walking, but the man then pulled in front of them, exited the car, and shoved Cheryl out of the way and threw Nancy in the back seat and sped off into the darkness. 5-year-old Cheryl was absolutely terrified, but she immediately ran home and told her parents what had happened. They then notified the police and began calling everyone they knew to help with the search. When police arrived, Cheryl said the man was a middle-aged Caucasian male with an average build and rosy cheeks. She said that he was wearing a tie, a dark coat or blazer, a dark hat, and black horn-rimmed glasses. Ironically, she said the man was wearing quote-unquote church clothes that were nearly identical to what the dozens of men had been wearing at church that morning. Within minutes afterwards, scores of police officers and volunteers began scouring every inch of the otherwise quiet town. Nancy's distraught parents insisted on starting at her last known location, but the sheriff told him that the area had already been searched and they should look elsewhere. Details of the search that night aren't super clear, other than the fact that no trace of Nancy was found that night. As with most missing persons cases, everyone knew that time was of the essence, but they held out hope that Nancy would eventually be found unharmed. However, tragically, although it's unclear who found her body or when they found it because different sources give drastically different accounts, either way, it wasn't a happy ending. Sometime the following morning or early that afternoon, her body was discovered in a wooded area not far from the abduction site. From then on, that patch of forest became known as Nancy's Woods. During the autopsy later that day, the Paulding County coroner determined that Nancy had been assaulted and shot once under the chin at close range. The .22 caliber bullet was then recovered, and hair, blood, and other DNA samples were also collected and handed over to investigators. Unfortunately, though, the weapon used was never recovered, and forensic DNA analysis was still more than 2 decades away. Over the following days, investigators followed up on countless leads, interviewed hundreds of residents, and checked dozens of cars that matched Cheryl's description, and they eventually compiled a list of nearly 300 suspects. Most were eventually ruled out because they had clean backgrounds and alibis, but a few had troubling pasts and were never able to account for their whereabouts on the day in question. The sheriff's office, meanwhile, didn't think the perpetrator was a resident of Paulding, but many locals weren't so sure. They obviously couldn't help but wonder what kind of person could commit such a heinous crime and whether the person was someone they knew, or more importantly, if their children were still in danger. What nobody knew at the time, however, was that another young girl had a similar, though thankfully non-fatal experience in Paulding at about the same time. Cindy Geyer Keith wasn't sure when exactly it happened, but she claims that she was abducted and assaulted multiple times beginning in 1959 or 1960 when she was 8 or 9 years old. According to Cindy, a dark vehicle came to stop beside her one day as she was walking down the street just before sunset. Then, to her surprise, a man got out, handcuffed her, threw her into the backseat, and sped off before she even had time to scream. Cindy had no idea why she was being taken or where the man was taking her, but she said that he attacked her later that night. And disturbingly, the supposed incident didn't take place in a forested area, the backseat of a car, or in a home on the outskirts of town. Instead, she said it happened in the town jail and that the perpetrator was a Paulding County deputy sheriff named Claire Paulus, also known as Bud. Cindy would also say that he held a gun to her head during the incident and that he took her and did this to her numerous times over a 2-year period. Tragically, as is often the case, she kept this a secret and suppressed the horrific memories the best that she could. According to local reports, Bud Paulus was a part-time Paulding deputy sheriff in 1957 and became a full-time member of the force on January 1st of the following year. He also co-owned a service station less than half a mile from the theater where Nancy and Cheryl were watching movies on Sunday, November 13th, 1960. Little is known about Bud's life over the following 2.5 decades, However, he was indicted by a Paulding County grand jury in early November of 1987, but it had nothing to do with Nancy or Cindy. Instead, the indictment alleged that he assaulted another unidentified girl he was related to years before. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter was never found because days before his scheduled court case, he would end things on his own accord. By then, Nancy's case had already gone hopelessly cold and was still considered to be unrelated. And despite steady pressure from her siblings, the police had little choice but to put the case on back burner until new leads or evidence surfaced. This was met with even more resistance by her family, and they even began to suspect that the local police department was engaged in a cover-up, because nearly every shred of physical evidence that had been collected from the crime scene in her body had mysteriously disappeared over the years. For the record, the cover-up claim has never been substantiated, despite the fact that the missing evidence is more than a little suspicious. Then, in 2023, a local television station opened its own investigation to see if it could solve the crime and give Nancy's family some much-needed closure. Early on, journalists attempted to interview two former Paulding County sheriffs. One was the sheriff when Bud passed away, and the other was actually his nephew. Neither of them agreed to be interviewed, but the television station went ahead with its investigation and ultimately produced a groundbreaking 3-part documentary about Nancy's death that aired in early 2023. They also came to the conclusion that the local sheriff's office had been engaged in an active cover-up. But again, this was just speculation based on new information and circumstantial evidence uncovered during the investigation. After the documentary aired, the television station and local authorities were flooded with tips, and many of the callers said that Bud had probably abducted, assaulted, and killed Nancy. Some even claimed that he was a known predator who may have targeted dozens of girls over the years. And keep in mind that at this point, the connection to Bud was still not really known. One of the viewers who eventually came forward and agreed to be interviewed was Cindy Geyer Keith. She would then tell investigators that Bud was the man who abducted her all the way back in 1959 or 1960. Later, Cindy's brother even confirmed that their parents had been good friends with Bud and his wife. According to Cindy and her brother, their parents often took them to stay with the Pauluses because they loved children but were unable to have their own. Cindy didn't tell Greg about the incident until decades later, but looking back, he said that he was never comfortable around Bud Paulus either. Cindy eventually began seeing a therapist to address the suppressed trauma and made progress, but even then, she said that her personality was irreparably damaged. To this day, she still has a hard time trusting anyone, and that she still gets panicky when people walk up behind her or put anything near her head or face. Journalists from the television station also reached out to Bud's wife during their investigation, but she declined to comment about her husband's possible role in the murder on the grounds that the allegations amounted to little more than gossip. Later, Cindy claimed that Bud's wife agreed to talk to her privately if she promised not to go public with the story, but she dismissed the offer because she thought it was an essential part of the healing process. Even now, the current sheriff can't say much about the case. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and the investigation is technically still ongoing even though the main suspect has been dead since 1987. The sheriff told investigative journalists that his office still follows up on tips, and at the very least, there's now a suspect card in the case file with Bud Paulus's name on it. And as you might imagine, Nancy's murder was particularly traumatic for her 5-year-old sister Cheryl, who was with her the evening she was abducted. She even recently collaborated with a forensic sketch artist who used her descriptions to create images of the perpetrator. Cheryl knows it's a long shot, but she hopes the artist's renderings may jog someone's memory, or better yet, tug on their heartstrings enough to motivate them to break the silence and help solve the case after so many years. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. In case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyway, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.